A wrought iron gate, once polished until it reflected the afternoon sun, now sags on rusted hinges. Beyond it, manicured lawns have turned to gravel, fountains leak into cracked basins, and the windows of marble halls gape like hollow eyes. This is not a ruin of neglect alone. It is a monument to battles fought in silence, where wealth became strategy and mansions became fortresses. Every wall, every corridor carries the residue of invisible conflicts, alliances brokered over champagne, families fractured over titles, fortunes leveraged and lost in quiet escalation. The architecture itself remembers: hidden doors, reinforced floors, private wings designed not for comfort, but for control. In these estates, power was exercised as much in shadow as in ceremony. And yet, what survives is fragile, a veneer of grandeur masking a history of private war. Today, these palaces stand largely emptied, their meaning reduced to photographs, auction catalogs, and whispered tales. The question looms before the story begins. What does it reveal when the theater of elite ambition is abandoned and only the scars remain? The struggle is no longer visible, yet its imprint persists, shaping the present through absence, silence, and the weight of what was once inviolable. To understand these palaces is to confront the architecture of influence itself and the human systems that animate, exploit, and ultimately hollow them. The gates stand slightly ajar, one hinge bowed under decades of disuse. Their wrought iron, once burnished until it mirrored the sky, now wears a patina of rust that mottles the surface with streaks of green and brown. A single panel hangs at an angle, swung by a wind that moves without constraint through the empty driveway. Beyond the threshold, the estate's scale becomes immediately apparent. Miles of lawns, once clipped to uniform perfection, now fracture under weeds that rise in irregular patterns, asserting a quiet claim over the geometry of order. Stone balustrades crumble in places, each fissure a record of years without oversight, while the gravel path, once raked into precise lines, has become a patchwork of sediment and shadow. Every architectural element registers the passage of absence, a slow erosion of both care and authority. The main house looms at the estate's center, its massing unchanged, but its presence hollowed. Windows, designed to frame the view and capture light, are clouded with dust, some cracked, a few entirely missing panes. The doors, thick and imposing, are no longer instruments of control, but thresholds to silence. Within the stone and marble walls, floors sag slightly, the result of long neglected maintenance and the ceaseless expansion of the building's own weight. Roof lines, once precise and sharp against the horizon, now bear irregularities, slate tiles missing, guttering torn. It is a structure that was engineered to dominate its surroundings, yet it now surrenders to time and gravity in ways that are quiet but undeniable. Even in decay, the markers of private conflict persist. Outbuildings, once utilitarian, stables, kitchens, servant quarters, are partially dismantled or sold, their doors open to the sky. Evidence of past disputes between heirs is etched into the grounds. Portions of the garden fenced off inconsistently, statues moved or removed, gates duplicated in ways that suggest competing claims rather than shared stewardship. The estate itself functions as a map of power exercised, contested, and fractured, though the battle has long ceased to be visible to anyone other than the structures themselves.
Shadows of corridors, wings, and halls testify to battles fought in silence, in spaces now devoid of witnesses. Along the perimeter, gates that once signaled authority over approach and entry now reveal a vulnerability that the original owners would have denied. Stone pillars, crowned with carved emblems of lineage and wealth, are cracked and pocked. The symbolism they carried has been replaced by the quiet language of entropy. Formerly private roads leading to service entrances are overgrown, markers of the labor that once maintained a strict hierarchy, now consumed by brush and wind. Even security, once an extension of the estate's ideology, has become irrelevant, allowing nature and neglect to encroach freely. The very design intended to assert permanence now signals fragility. Inside, the echoes of human presence remain in partial form. Faded carpets trace paths once trodden with deliberation. Chandeliers hang empty, wires exposed, their original function rendered obsolete by the absence of staff to maintain them. Fireplaces stand cold, mantels coated with dust, while light from the setting sun traces fractured reflections across marble floors, illuminating the dissonance between scale and emptiness. It is clear that control, once meticulously exercised, has slipped entirely. The estate no longer dictates terms, it reacts, yielding to the slow pressures of abandonment, auctions, and partial renovations that address only surface appearances. This ruin is neither sudden nor spectacular. It is a slow, observable fracture. The estate's walls, gates, and lawns are testimony to what happens when the mechanisms of authority, inheritance, wealth, labor, hierarchy fail or are withdrawn. Each broken hinge, sagging roofline, and empty corridor functions as a record, a quiet ledger of vulnerability. The spectacle is not in violence or dramatic collapse, but in the persistence of absence, the steady withdrawal of oversight and influence that transforms what was once formidable into a structure negotiating its own decay. In these moments, the stakes of private conflict, once fought in subtle ways over rooms, art, and control, become legible in the material world.
The palaces did not exist merely as residences. They were instruments of cultural orchestration, calibrated to project influence beyond their gates. Each wing, gallery, and salon was conceived with the precision of a map, charting networks of allegiance, patronage, and social visibility. The placement of a staircase, the orientation of a window, the sequence of reception rooms, all were gestures intended to regulate how visitors moved, what they saw, and how they understood their host's authority. In these estates, architecture became a language of command, speaking in volumes of space, scale, and ornamentation rather than words. To walk through a main hall was to be immersed in a carefully constructed hierarchy. The placement of portraits, the arrangement of furnishings, even the weight of a carpet indicated status, proximity, and favor. Every element was a signal, and those attuned to its grammar understood it instinctively. Beyond the interior, gardens and grounds functioned as extensions of influence. Lawns were not merely decorative, they were stages for visibility. Long axial vistas directed attention toward monuments or fountains, positioning the visitor within a controlled perspective. Terraces and parterres became sites of observation and congregation, where conversations unfolded under the measured choreography of the estate's design. Hosts could manage not only movement, but perception, who could be seen, what could be observed, and how every encounter might reinforce hierarchy.
These open spaces were simultaneously theatrical and strategic, allowing the household to signal refinement, authority, and cultural discernment to the surrounding social sphere. Art and collections amplified this authority. Every painting, sculpture, or objet d'art was selected for its resonance, its capacity to convey taste, erudition, or lineage. Rooms were curated with an almost forensic attention, each piece positioned to assert a narrative of sophistication and discernment. Guests were guided through these displays, consciously or unconsciously, absorbing the values and judgments embedded in their host's choices. The palace itself became an active participant in social education, shaping ideas of refinement, aesthetic legitimacy, and cultural authority. In effect, the estate functioned as a microcosm of broader societal hierarchies. Those who understood the codes of placement and display could navigate its power. Those who did not were marginalized within its spatial grammar. Control over access was equally crucial. Arrival points, entry halls, and private chambers were designed to regulate who moved where and when. Proximity was power, and the architecture codified that proximity. Gatekeepers, servants, and attendants were extensions of the spatial hierarchy, each fulfilling a role in maintaining the intended distribution of influence. A visitor's journey through the palace was choreographed, whether consciously or unconsciously, to reflect their social weight relative to the household. Access could be granted or withheld. Rooms could be opened to impress or closed to exclude. Every movement through the space was an encounter with the estate's system of authority, reinforcing both social and cultural dominance without explicit confrontation. Even beyond formal gatherings, the estate projected influence through less visible means. Patronage networks radiated outward, supported by the household's strategic hosting of artists, intellectuals, and political figures. Decisions about commissions, donations, or social introductions were encoded within the rhythms of palace life, mediated through salons, dinners, and private audiences. The estate operated as a node within a wider lattice of power. Its reach extended into civic, cultural, and economic spheres. Control over the palace was inseparable from control over these connections. The physical and symbolic were entwined, and mastery over one reinforced authority over the other. The foundations of these estates were rarely accidental. Each was conceived as a statement, a deliberate projection of ambition rendered in stone, brick, and landscape. The site itself was chosen not merely for convenience or beauty, but for strategic resonance, elevated ground to command the horizon, proximity to emerging transportation networks, adjacency to other centers of influence. Even in its earliest conception, the estate functioned as an instrument of position. Builders considered sight lines, access, and the interplay of natural and constructed features as if designing a system rather than a residence. A river might be diverted to frame a perspective, a grove preserved to control light and shadow across a facade. Every decision served a dual purpose, aesthetic and strategic, blending personal vision with social signaling. The patrons who commissioned these palaces were themselves figures enmeshed in broader systems of commerce, politics, and cultural authority. Wealth was never inert. It was a tool, its deployment carefully calibrated. Capital enabled architecture, but architecture, in turn, amplified capital's effect. Builders worked in consultation with financiers, architects, and artists to create spaces that codified status. The interior layouts reflected not only domestic requirements, but also networks of influence, salons for controlled gatherings, galleries for curated display, corridors designed to direct encounters. Function and message were inseparable. The estate was simultaneously home, instrument, and declaration. Artisans and laborers operated within this vision, translating ambition into form through painstaking work. Stonecutters carved façades to communicate permanence, woodworkers crafted paneling to signal refinement, and gardeners arranged parterres to project order over land and labor. Each craft, each detail, became a medium for asserting authority. The scale of construction alone required coordination across hierarchies of staff and management, revealing how control over labor mirrored control over social standing. The estate emerged not as a singular product, but as the material culmination of interconnected systems, economic, social, and aesthetic, woven tightly around a central vision of influence. Ownership itself was a statement of intent. Land was consolidated through negotiation, inheritance, and acquisition, reflecting a deliberate accumulation of both material and symbolic power. Each acquisition reinforced the estate's capacity to impress and dominate. The built environment became a ledger of ambition. Terraces, wings, and annexes marked successive phases of expansion, each expansion corresponding to a new assertion of capability or authority. Even auxiliary structures, the stables, servant quarters, and carriage houses, were positioned and constructed to maintain the coherence of a system designed to exert influence rather than merely to house activity. The placement of the estate within the social landscape was equally calculated. Roads, sightlines to neighboring properties, and proximity to centers of commerce and governance all shaped the estate's capacity to act as a node of visibility and negotiation. The architecture was less a passive backdrop than a participant in the social networks it sought to command. Visitors approached not simply a residence, but a controlled environment designed to orient perception and convey hierarchy. Every element, from the grading of the approach to the orientation of reception rooms, was an argument in spatial form, a tangible claim to prominence whose meaning could be read by those trained to see it. The estate functioned less as a singular dwelling than as an intricate organism, sustained by a network of labor, finance, and routine. Staff hierarchies were rigid, codified in manuals, memoranda, and oral instruction, and each position carried responsibilities that extended far beyond simple service. Footmen, housekeepers, gardeners, and stewards operated in interlocking systems, each movement, each task observed, measured, and often recorded. The coordination required to maintain the estate's scale was formidable, a continuous negotiation of time, space, and human energy. In this network, authority flowed not merely from the owner's presence, but from the invisible structures that organized labor and regulated behavior. Financial oversight was equally exacting. Budgets were drafted for months in advance, anticipating every necessity, from food supplies to fuel, from garden upkeep to the maintenance of art collections. Ledgers and journals were maintained with care, balancing the estate's symbolic and operational demands. Expenditures were scrutinized, not solely for efficiency, but for the projection of power. Lavish feasts signaled influence, while well-maintained interiors demonstrated discipline and permanence. Money, though abstract in the broader economy, assumed concrete form here, its allocation shaping not only the physical environment, but also the social and cultural rhythms of the household. Daily routines were choreographed with precision. Breakfasts, dinners, and receptions were scheduled as much for the reinforcement of hierarchy as for sustenance or ceremony. Service followed strict protocols, dictating sequence, posture, and interaction. Rooms were opened or closed according to planned agendas. Corridors, staircases, and vestibules channeled movement to reinforce authority and surveillance.
The repetition of these routines functioned as both practical necessity and ideological reinforcement. Labor, etiquette, and spatial control intertwined to sustain an enduring impression of order and mastery. Outside the main house, gardens and auxiliary spaces followed equally meticulous regimes. Groundskeepers monitored lawns and parterres as carefully as any ledger, responding to seasonal cycles and the aesthetic demands of the household. The placement of benches, fountains, and statuary was maintained to exact specifications, ensuring that visitors' experience unfolded according to the estate's design logic. Stables, carriage houses, and service quarters were treated as extensions of this system. Every horse, vehicle, and piece of equipment was catalogued, repaired, and positioned to serve both function and symbolism. Labor was never neutral. It acted as an instrument of control, maintaining the rhythm, appearance, and hierarchy of the estate at all times. Communication within the estate operated through coded routines as well. Messengers, memoranda, and subtle signals allowed the owner to extend authority across vast spaces. Footmen and valets became conduits for directives, often mediating interactions between the family and visiting dignitaries or merchants. Even seemingly trivial tasks, folding a napkin in a precise way, adjusting a curtain, participated in the reinforcement of a system where detail reflected discipline. Every human action, every gesture, was a component of a larger machine designed to reproduce power continuously, day by day, season by season.
At the apex of its existence, the estate functioned as a theater of influence in which every space, object, and ritual reinforced the household's authority. The gardens, corridors, and galleries were no longer merely functional or ornamental. They were instruments for orchestrating social hierarchy, shaping perception, and exercising soft power. Salons were arranged to cultivate networks of patronage, to display discernment in art, literature, and taste, and to test the agility of visitors within an intricate social lattice. Every event, whether a dinner, a reception, or a private viewing, was a rehearsal of status, choreographed to affirm both visibility and control. The household had grown accustomed to a rhythm that combined discipline with spectacle. Staff operated like a silent engine. Valets, butlers, and footmen executed their roles with precision, ensuring that the household's presence projected a continuous impression of efficiency and refinement. Gardens were maintained to an exacting standard, seasonal blooms and trimmed hedges signaling attentiveness to both aesthetic and symbolic order. Kitchens produced not merely sustenance, but demonstrations of culinary sophistication meant to reinforce authority. The coordination of these elements, labor, presentation, and timing, ensured that the estate functioned simultaneously as home, cultural center, and instrument of influence. Art and decoration played a decisive role in signaling refinement and authority. Portraits of ancestors, commissioned by the family, were displayed in positions calculated to direct attention and infer lineage. Tapestries, rare books, and objects of curiosity were arranged to reflect judgment, taste, and erudition. Every corridor and gallery became a narrative of accomplishment, an argument constructed of marble, wood, and pigment, asserting that power was both inherited and exercised. Visitors absorbed these cues with subtle immediacy, recognizing in spatial arrangements and curated collections the consolidation of wealth and authority. The estate's social influence extended beyond its walls. Invitations to events were deliberate instruments extended selectively to cultivate alliances, reward loyalty, and delineate exclusion. Political and economic discussions, while informal, unfolded within carefully constructed environments designed to signal alignment, gauge ambition, and reinforce social hierarchy.
Conversations that appeared casual were framed by space and ritual, where proximity, position, and access conveyed as much as the words themselves. The household, in effect, functioned as a node in wider networks of influence, its internal orchestration magnifying its capacity to shape taste, opinion, and allegiance across society. Financial resources at this height were vast and meticulously managed. Patronage flowed outward in commissions, gifts, and loans, reinforcing networks that underwrote the estate's prestige. Expenditures were calibrated to reinforce both the perception and the reality of power. Grand entertainments, extensive collections, and meticulously maintained grounds signaled wealth beyond calculation, yet were sustained through detailed oversight. The circulation of money, labor, and attention was continuous, creating an ecosystem in which visibility and influence fed one another. The estate, in these years, was simultaneously a residence and a mechanism, its very operation a demonstration of authority, exercised with both subtlety and precision.
The first signs of strain appeared not in sudden collapse, but in the subtle rearrangements of routine and expectation. Where the household once moved in seamless synchrony, schedules began to fracture, staffing levels fluctuating in ways that were immediately visible to those attuned to the estate's rhythms. Certain wings, once fully maintained, received attention only intermittently. Gardens were trimmed in part but allowed to creep unchecked elsewhere. These were not the results of negligence alone, but of shifting resources and priorities imposed from outside the estate's immediate control. Authority, previously absolute within its walls, now encountered resistance in the form of constraint, financial, social, and political. Economic pressures began to alter the estate's internal calculus. Revenue streams that had supported staff, maintenance, and acquisitions fluctuated under market forces and taxation, while inheritances, loans, or family settlements reallocated capital in ways that undermined operational cohesion. Budgets, once expansive and flexible, were scrutinized with greater intensity, and the distribution of resources became a measure not only of wealth, but of strategic necessity. The household's circulation of money, labor, and attention contracted, and even minor decisions, timing of repairs, frequency of entertainments, or the rotation of servants, were influenced by forces that could not be contained by architecture or protocol alone. Social expectations also introduced pressure. The estate, once a locus of unchallenged taste and authority, now faced scrutiny from a broader network of peers and observers. Invitations, appearances, and alignments became arenas for judgment. Failing to host, underperforming in display, or appearing inattentive could erode reputation as effectively as mismanagement of funds. The mechanisms of influence were no longer entirely internal. External perception began to dictate actions, constraining the household's discretion. Every event, every gesture carried amplified significance, a reflection of pressures whose source lay beyond the gates. Ownership itself became a source of tension. Heirs, trustees, and distant relatives exercised influence intermittently, sometimes in opposition, sometimes through delayed or conditional approvals. The estate was transformed from a single coherent system into a site of negotiation, where decision-making was filtered through multiple centers of authority. Corridors and wings that had been controlled entirely by household hierarchy now reflected compromises, inconsistent maintenance, and intermittent oversight. Authority, once enforced through proximity and routine, had begun to leak outward into consultation and concession, fragmenting the seamless orchestration of labor, space, and culture. Even the flow of labor was disrupted. Experienced staff left, replaced by temporary or less familiar personnel. Apprenticeships and training programs could no longer be maintained with the same rigor. Institutional memory began to erode, and the tacit knowledge embedded in sequences of service, room arrangement, and ceremonial choreography weakened. Where a butler or housekeeper once could operate the estate with instinctive awareness, gaps in instruction now introduced hesitation and error. The estate's systems were still operational, but they no longer exhibited the same precision, leaving spaces for small inefficiencies to accumulate over time, quietly reshaping both form and perception.
The estate remained vast, imposing, and meticulously arranged, yet its vitality had begun to dissipate. Where once the corridors resonated with the quiet rhythm of countless attendants moving in coordination, silence now settled over long stretches of halls. Rooms were kept clean, walls polished, and gardens pruned, but these were gestures rather than necessities. The presence of labor was no longer embedded in sustained systems of care. It appeared in sporadic, transactional bursts. Symbolism was preserved, the appearance of continuity maintained, even as the functional cohesion that had underpinned the estate's authority eroded. Financial resources, once abundant and flowing freely, had become constrained. Capital that had supported extensive staff, lavish entertainments, and the careful rotation of objects and spaces was now diverted, reduced, or absent. Art collections were catalogued and lent, wings of the house sealed off to cut maintenance costs, and rooms previously used for reception were left largely empty. The architecture remained, but it no longer operated as a system. Halls, staircases, and salons were spaces without the habitual circulation that had given them meaning. The estate had become a vessel, intact in form, but increasingly hollow in function. Staffing structures contracted sharply. Experienced footmen, valets, and housekeepers departed for steadier work elsewhere. Positions once filled to maintain continuous operation were consolidated, shared, or eliminated. The remaining personnel operated under constant pressure, performing duties across multiple domains without the former precision or depth of knowledge. Institutional memory began to fragment. Sequences of service, subtle ceremonial protocols, and nuanced arrangements of rooms and objects were observed inconsistently as survival replaced mastery. Every gesture of care became calculated, every movement rationed, the estate's inner machinery now operating in a skeletonized form. Despite these pressures, the estate's symbolic potency was meticulously maintained. Gardens were mown, facades cleaned, and interiors arranged to impress the occasional visitor or appraiser. Fountains were repaired, chandeliers polished, and tapestries hung in prominent positions. These gestures projected an image of continuity, suggesting unbroken authority, even as the underlying systems, staffing, finances, and operational coordination had ceased to function as before. In this way, the estate operated as a visual argument rather than a living system, prioritizing appearance over the complex orchestration that had once animated its spaces. The processes of extraction were deliberate as well as involuntary. Furnishings, art, and ancillary property were sold, loaned, or redistributed. Wings of the house closed, outbuildings dismantled, and portions of the grounds ceded or neglected. This stripping of resources was gradual, often imperceptible to the casual observer, yet cumulative in effect. What had once been a fully integrated organism, a coordinated network of architecture, labor, and ritual, now functioned as a skeletal framework, capable of conveying power visually, but incapable of sustaining it operationally. Even the circulation of visitors changed. Social and cultural gatherings became rare, their scale diminished, and their orchestration simplified.
Ceremonial routines, once essential for reinforcing hierarchy, now occurred sporadically, often performed with improvised staff or borrowed expertise. Spaces that had been theaters of influence and negotiation were reduced to stages of display, their function as nodes of power greatly diminished. The estate's presence remained commanding, but the activity that had legitimized that presence had been largely extracted, leaving an echo of authority in its place.
What persists of the estate is fragmentary, yet materially resolute. Certain wings retain their original scale and proportion, roof lines intact, façades unbroken by time. Marble staircases, polished to a muted sheen, remain in quiet service, their steps echoing faintly with the occasional visitor or caretaker. In these preserved sections, the alignment of corridors, the cadence of doorways, and the proportional logic of rooms hint at the systems that once governed every motion within. Though much of the original orchestration has dissipated, the bones of spatial authority endure, allowing the estate to testify to its former operational complexity. Art and curated collections survive in selective form. Paintings hang on walls shielded from direct light, occasionally catalogued or lent to exhibitions beyond the property. Sculptures and objets d'art are arranged in their original positions where possible, though gaps and missing pieces mark the selective extraction of wealth over time. The placement of these objects remains deliberate, a faint residue of the estate's former intelligence, a gallery of influence that communicates hierarchy, taste, and lineage even in partial preservation. What remains is not only a record of aesthetic judgment, but a vestige of the system of power that commissioned, displayed, and interpreted it. Foundations of lost wings or demolished outbuildings still trace the original intentions of design. Brick and stonework protrude in irregular patterns where structures have been removed or collapsed, revealing the hidden logic of circulation, labor, and hierarchy. Pathways that once connected service areas to reception halls are partially intact, overgrown yet legible, showing the careful coordination of movement and function that once animated the estate. These residual frameworks allow observers to reconstruct, in principle, the comprehensive architecture of labor, ceremony, and control that the estate embodied. Archival records, ledgers, correspondences, photographs act as extensions of material survival. Budgets, maintenance logs, and inventories provide insight into the intensity and precision of prior operations. Letters and guest lists map networks of influence and the mechanisms by which reputation was curated. Even fragments of these documents, often dispersed or partially preserved, allow the estate to assert its historical significance. The tangible record exists in parallel to the physical structure, reinforcing meaning where walls and corridors alone cannot. Together, architecture and archive preserve a selective narrative of endurance, offering both proof and evidence of deliberate control across generations. Labor practices, though greatly diminished, leave traces in surviving buildings and grounds. Service staircases, tucked behind grand halls, remain intact. Pantries, kitchens, and storage spaces reveal the invisible choreography of staff. Flooring retains wear patterns that mark habitual movement. Railings and door handles bear the subtle evidence of repeated purposeful use. These traces are neither symbolic nor decorative. They are the material residue of systems, demonstrating how the estate operated as an organized, hierarchical organism. The surviving structures carry memory of function even in the absence of those who enacted it. The landscape itself registers continuity and loss. Terraces remain geometrically precise where care has been maintained, while other sections fall to scrub and irregular growth. Stone fountains retain their basins, occasionally replenished, though many operate only intermittently.
Long axial vistas remain perceptible, though obstructed by encroaching vegetation. The estate, in these partial survivals, maintains its capacity to communicate scale, control, and intent, though the effect is now mediated through absence as much as presence. Visitors and caretakers encounter both what endures and what has vanished, allowing the architecture to articulate a history of selective preservation.
The estates endure, not as functioning organisms, but as material arguments constructed in stone and earth, asserting claims about wealth, hierarchy, and cultural authority. Their walls, wings, and façades outlast the disputes, inheritances, and debts that once determined their operation, yet the meaning of these structures is neither fixed nor simple. Visitors trace the proportions of staircases, the rhythm of galleries, and the breadth of vistas, reading in them the remnants of a deliberate order. Every preserved detail, an archway, a fountain, a hand-carved panel, carries with it an implication of control, a record of the intricate choreography once enacted within these spaces. The estate, in this sense, is an archive in 3 dimensions, encoding both power and its fragility. The persistence of these spaces prompts questions that the buildings themselves cannot answer. How much authority survived through architecture alone, and how much depended on systems of labor, finance, and social negotiation that no longer exist? Rooms maintained for effect, gardens pruned for perception, and galleries curated to impress suggest that legacy can be performed even when the underlying apparatus has vanished. In some cases, preservation emphasizes continuity over authenticity, projecting an image of stability while concealing the processes of extraction, decline, and contestation that have shaped the estate over decades or centuries. The buildings, in their silent endurance, function as both witness and interpreter, leaving interpretation to those who observe. Art and material culture embedded within the estates continue to communicate influence, albeit through fragments. Portraits, tapestries, and architectural ornamentation retain a capacity to articulate taste, lineage, and ambition. Yet these signs are incomplete, their original logic partially obscured by absence, rearrangement, or dispersal. Visitors and historians encounter objects that once circulated within a fully functioning network of labor, ceremony, and social expectation. Now, detached from that context, the objects testify as much to what has been lost as to what remains. They are traces of authority, calibrated to suggest continuity while simultaneously recording absence. The surrounding landscape reinforces the message of enduring prominence, even as ecological and structural shifts rewrite the estate's scale. Terraces, walls, and pathways continue to define vistas, framing perspectives in a manner that recalls the original choreography of movement and sight. Where formal gardens are maintained, they echo systems of order and control. Where they fall to overgrowth, they signal the limits of preservation. These contrasting conditions underscore the estate's dual nature, simultaneously survivor and relic, functioning as an instrument of memory while illustrating the fragility of power when divorced from the apparatus that originally sustained it. In considering these estates, one confronts the interplay between permanence and temporality. Stone resists decay, yet the practices, labor, and protocols that once animated these spaces do not. Legacy, therefore, is contingent, dependent as much on cultural attention, historical interpretation, and selective preservation as on the buildings themselves. Each retained wing or artifact is both a testament to past authority and a challenge to contemporary understanding.
It asserts meaning without guaranteeing comprehension, suggesting lessons about ambition and influence while leaving gaps, silences, and unresolved questions in its wake.